creativity is kind of this human process of how we get things done. That if we can master that mindset shift quickly, they call that also lateral thinking. One of the myths for us artists is this tortured artist thing where you have to be kind of just in a terrible state in order to create great work. And it's been proven that's not necessarily true.
Welcome to the Be Better broadcast. Imagine this. Imagine you're able to unlock your full creative potential, your full creative genius as a leader, as a musician, as a business professional, as someone inside their own business or working inside of a corporation. What would it look like in your life, your relationships, your career, if you were able to activate your full creative potential? And you might be asking, Brandon, what would you describe as creative potential? What does it look like when someone is operating at their max level of their creative genius? And I'm going to ask that question to our very special guest today, all the way from California. His name is Rich Kirkpatrick, and he's authored a book titled Mind Blown: Unlock Your Creative Genius by Bridging Science and Magic. So what do science and magic have to do with creative genius? And specifically, I'm really curious about the magic part. So if you want to unlock your creative genius, this conversation is going to help you do that. If you take away even just one piece of advice or a strategy or an insight from this conversation with me and Rich, all that we ask is you share this show with just one other person who could use it as well. You are the reason the Be Better broadcast has grown to over 340 episodes, has reached thousands of people, because you are the best part of the Be Better team. So for those who don't know Rich Kirkpatrick, he writes, consults, and speaks about the intersection of creativity, faith, and leadership. Last year in 2022, he authored Mind Blown: Unlock Your Creative Genius by Bridging Science and Magic. He's also a musician, a songwriter, and a recording artist with the group A Beautiful Liturgy. Rich is based in the East San Francisco Bay Area in California. And because of today's technological advances, we're able to have this conversation together to bring you what you need to know about creative genius. Rich, it's great to have you here. Thanks so much for being here, sir.
It's my pleasure. Good morning.
I think the only logical place to begin here is to really dive into this idea of what does it look like when someone is operating from a place of full creative genius? Because you, in your profession, I mean, you're an author. I'm sure you've got business in your background of some sort. And I'm curious to hear what that looks like for you. You are a musician. You're every day tapping into your creative potential, right? And I think everyone listening is. What does it look like when we are operating at that max level of creativity?
Well, one thing that's interesting is it doesn't look the same for everybody. I have these two characters in the book, a robot and a wizard, because some of us are wizards like me, where we're kind of the artistic types, where we, alchemy and dreams and spells or whatever. The magic is kind of on our side. And then some of us create like robots. We're methodical. We have kind of a distinct technology that we're working with. Like the scientist, you have a method. You begin with the method first. But what happens in the brain does look the same. And so in that regard, what it looks like are basically two main brain networks that we shift between, which kind of are represented by, I use science and magic as a metaphor, or robots and wizards for those two things. So it looks like us shifting two different brain networks, or mindsets, I guess, if you will.
Interesting. Okay, so if there's the wizard and the robot, are we born either the wizard or the robot? Because when you say robot, like you said, I think of the scientist, or I think of the engineer, right? Who they are very much creative geniuses, but they have a different way of going about their creative process, right? So are you born either a wizard or a robot, or is that something that you learn and adopt as you go through life?
Well, there are basically a 80-20 split here. So 80% of us prefer, and I don't know, it's kind of debatable whether we're born to be kind of this robot that or not. But our society basically puts a lot of importance on finding that one answer, having things in a not mythology. I'm thinking about magic, but with methods. There you go.
Yes.
Where the other side, the other 20% are the wizards, and we kind of, like me, got suppressed. And so maybe the book I wrote is kind of personal trauma I had to deal with. The kid who doodled, the kid who dreamed and came up with things, and so So really these two different things, I think we are born with it. We do have different kinds of brains. I'm ADHD, so I have a quote neurodivergent type of a brain that I was born with. I didn't choose that. I would not choose it. Um, but the thing is, yeah, so you're born with one of those things perhaps, but also I think society kind of values, depending on your culture, one or the other.
Why was your book important last year? So when you came out with Mind Blown, what was the impetus that caused you to say the world needs this message on creativity?
Well, let's just think about how hard it is today to have a conversation with somebody who we disagree with. And the reason I think that is because we're using different mindsets. And these two, the brain networks I mentioned, there's the default mode network and the central executive network, just to get a little nerdy about it. And those two things, if we're not understanding where a person's coming from or able to shift between, let's say, being critical to listen to somebody, but also at the same time being empathetic and being intuitive and understanding what that is, and where we are strong or not, or where the other person is, it's hard to have a conversation. So that's one example of just where it is. And if you feel misunderstood, I think this information might be good for you.
If you feel misunderstood, this is good for you.
Oh yeah, because I think what happens sometimes is we're trying to figure out how do I connect my idea, for instance, because this is really what creativity is about, taking something that's abstract and making it into something reality, whether it's a business plan or whether it's a song I hear in my head and I had to turn it into an actual production that you can listen on Spotify. So those steps, that's the creative process.
Mm.
Um, being misunderstood, I think often is how can I help you see what it is that I got inside my head here that I'm excited about or worried about.
Okay.
And so those are the things.
So if you have this picture in your mind of the maximum level of creative genius, right? Where you have this idea for a song and you're able to then take that idea and you're able to flesh it out into all the individual pieces, and then boom, you've got The Wall by Pink Floyd, or you've got whatever you're creating, right? This beautiful masterpiece that started as an idea. Let's say that that's the ultimate place of creative genius. What's the opposite of that? And the reason I ask you this is because I know that especially in today's world, a lot of the people listening are inside of the corporate world. They're building their careers, they're starting their own business, and at times we feel like we don't even know what the next best step is to take. And then we hear these beautiful albums and we see these people who are making giant leaps in business, and we're like, what are they doing that I'm not doing? Like I grew up this great way. I speak the English language very well. I'm a smart person. I'm educated. I've got a degree, whatever it might look like. There is a lot of people who just don't know what that next step is. And it's hard to tap into your creativity if you're unsure in general. And you mentioned ADHD. And I gather that a lot of people in today's world, whether they're born with it or not, have this ADHD brain of distractions and always finding it difficult to focus on one thing because of all the things that are available to us. So what is the opposite of maximum creative genius? Is it uncertainty? Is it being lost? What does that look like?
Well, that's a really interesting question because it can look like again, a lot of things, but creativity, here's the thing, way to look at it. It's a process, not a product. So everybody thinks creativity is this thing at the end. And so we always look towards the end. But it's like looking at someone's tombstone and saying that's your life and or whatever. All the stuff that we do, the trophy we win, for instance, maybe not a tombstone, depending on how morbid you are, but you have to think of it as process. And so in creativity, the researchers have kind of agreed that there's really four ways of describing, four kind of phases that you could be in. And so depending on the phase, what your next step is different. And the first one, when you're young or when you're new at a project or something, it's called preparation. And that's when you got to till the soil for a farmer, or as a musician, I got to learn my scales. You got to basically get a lot of stuff done. It's kind of the skyscraper where all the infrastructure goes in. It takes a couple years sometimes, even before you start to see beams go up.
Mm.
So where you are in the process, oftentimes will help you decide where to take your next step. And so the first course step is just to prepare. And so if you're in your career, for instance, and you're preparing your portfolio or your skills, that's legitimately may feel like you're not even going forward because you're still finding out your limits and things like that.
Okay, so it's not necessarily a place of, because it's very easy to be upset with yourself if you're unsure of what that next step is for you, if you're unsure how to flesh out that idea. But rather than be upset with ourselves, it sounds like what you're saying is take a look logically at the phase that you're in, right? So that
Yes.
first phase is the preparation phase, right? And are we going through these phases in each part of our life, or is our life essentially this process of phases in itself?
Well, creativity, I believe, is just another way to describe what humans do when we thrive. So, what it looks like to not be creating is to not thriving. That's to be
Oh,
depressed, to stay in your bed, or
yeah.
whatever. But it's a very human process. So, if we look at it that way, we can just say, obviously, I'm not thriving as a person, so I'm not going to be moving forward as a person. And so, one of the myths for us artists is this tortured artist thing where you have to be kind of just in a terrible state in order to create great work. And it's been proven that's not necessarily true. It's not that you want to seek comfort, but growth in any kind of growth we have requires some kind of effort. What the problem, like you're kind of mentioning, is are we doing the right thing that's going to move us forward?
Mm,
And so one of the things I did is kind of deconstruct the research that I read and looked after. And there's basically 3 parts of creativity. There's discovery, there's development, and there's delivery. And so the discovery phase is that preparation, it's the idea that comes to you, it's that part of it. The second part is the development. You gotta test it. Will this really work? And the third part of it is how we get it out and construct it. So the metaphors I use is the dream, the story, and the sandbox. And so the dream is kind of the wizard saying, "Aha, there it is." And then the development's kind of like, I'm actually in the sandbox. Tech people use that all the time. How do we test software in a sandbox? It's kind of where's my limitations, my budget, et cetera. Will this thing really withstand engineering if you're in the technical part? And then constructing it, getting it out to the world. And so as a musician, I get the idea for the song, and then I test the idea out and with a producer or my musical collaborators. And then there's a point where I'm actually in the studio and we're recording it and we decide this is kind of how it is. And then they take it from there. They master it, and which is an interesting process, the science of it. So my music goes from this dream and the wizard all the way to the robot. But sometimes it starts with the robot where I have 3 minutes of a song, for instance. And so I use those three things to basically troubleshoot the question that you have. It's like, why
mm,
am I stuck? Well, maybe my idea needs more development. Or maybe in the constructing, I'm learning something. This isn't me. It's not my story. It's why the story is important. And so even if I can do it and have the budget to do it, and the idea is good, maybe I shouldn't be doing it. And so I use that as a way to help us. But there's things that you mentioned there about, the small and big of it. There's micro processes and there's macro processes. So in creativity, just like in life, we have strategies in how we move forward that have to do with just today, the things I can do today. But then there's also things I realize, okay, I'm in a big long-term commitment for something, whether it's
mm.
relationships or it's a career. So we have to kind of look at it both.
Interesting. Okay, so I love that those three parts there. So we have the dream, which can also be looked at as the idea in itself. Then we have the story, and then we have the sandbox, which is the execution and the creation of that idea physically.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So do we have a certain amount of focus available? And let's go back to what you said about ADHD, because that neurodivergence, I think, is a really important part of this. Do you find yourself going through this dream story sandbox process with multiple things at once? Or are you focused on one thing at a time? Or is it one thing in each of the areas of your life at a time? Like, how many things are you, and how many things are we as people, based on what you've seen and what you've observed as a coach, a speaker? How much are we focusing on too many things versus one thing?
I think this is kind of where we look at life. I have mental health, I also have physical health. And so it's like, my trainer, to help me get in shape is going to ask me to do some things every day, but then some things a couple times a week. But then also it's up to my mindset. It's up to my mental health to say, I got to get out of bed and value that I'm going to do this.
Mm,
And so I think, when we look at it, look at something as a process as opposed to just the product, because it's overwhelming to think of being on 15 different projects, but I've I've been there before. And that is kind of what life is sometimes. You have to figure out a new commute with a new job and things like that, and still do your work if you're new in a company. All these kinds of things, we have certain points that we're dealing with. So I think creativity, what it does for us, it helps us to realize that being grounded in the present, and thinking and having my mind with the agility to go between these two things of divergent thought versus convergent thought, the magic and the science, the robot and the wizard.
Hmm.
That's what creative genius is. So if I'm able to be agile in that, just like if I'm physically fit and mentally fit, I'm going to be able to handle a lot of things as they come at me, even if it's not easy. Creativity is kind of this human process of how we get things done, that if we can master that mindset shift quickly, they call that also lateral thinking. So you have uh, the default mode, which we try to get out of, which we're saying, mindfulness kind of gives us, that's another net. It's not necessarily creativity, but it helps us to kind of just get out of all the noise. But we actually have to let noise in to say, what's actually going on with me? What am I actually seeing? The problem. An engineer saying, I have to look at everything here and not miss anything. So that's kind of the divergent thought. Where the convergent thoughts, I've done that enough at certain points where now I have to narrow things down. And moving between those kind of mindsets quickly can allow us to manage a lot of the stressors of how we get things done.
Hmm.
Um, and so that's kind of why I look at creativity. It's not just, for me as a musician trying to figure out how to be more, creative, um, get more ideas and et cetera. It's actually, how do I keep doing it? How do I keep getting up and making more good stuff?
Yeah. It sounds like there's a giant correlation between creativity being there when you are taking care of your physical and your mental health, right? And if those two things aren't there, then it's hard for creativity to enter the mix in general if your overall well-being isn't there. It sounds like those two things go together in a massive way. So I want to talk to you about that, but going back to the three steps here. We look at the dream, the story, and then the sandbox. So, okay, so we have an idea, right? You might have an idea for a song, an entrepreneur might have an idea for a business. How do you know when it's a great idea versus
Mhm.
just an idea?
Well, first of all, if you have only one idea, you can be rest assured that it's probably not the only and best idea. So that's often what happens is we think it's an idea, it can work, it can do. Let's go, let's run with it. And there's always that guy in the brainstorm meeting, and you're thinking, okay, we have one thing on the board, and it makes sense. He says we're done. But the truth of the matter is that the more ideas that we actually create, the more better ideas we create. And this is where the kind of economy of things is maybe confusing to our sensibilities. It's like now we have all the stuff, but it's really, and when you can filter the fact that you have 5 things that you can do that can work, and yet that tells you that the best and a really great ideas among them. If you have only 3 ideas or one idea in particular, like I said, then maybe it's not going to be great. Maybe it's not going to pull you forward. So I think that's one indicator of it.
Is there a way that you like to bring together all of the individual ideas? So you've got like what you mentioned as the brainstorming session. So let's say when you were putting your book together, as an example, it sounds like you might have had other ideas of the direction you could have gone, because when you decide to create a book, it's a massive undertaking, especially because you got to write the book. You've got to get the cover art. You've got to have it edited. You've got to market it, because now it's created, but now it's time to market it and sell it, which is what we're doing right now. You're spreading the word of the book. So this is part of that sandbox process. Okay. How do you like to put together all of the ideas that you have so that you're not just stuck with one? Are you a flip chart guy? Are you a whiteboard guy? Are you speaking to one person or a group of people? How do you organize your ideas?
I probably do all of those things, not at the same time. But really, an idea has to be put down on paper or a whiteboard or some kind of medium for you to be able to kind of look at it outside of your head, outside of yourself. That's part of the process of taking abstract things to concrete things. And so I take that magical thought or whatever it is. It's just like a song I might have heard in a dream. And I might actually write that down in a notebook and find out how terrible it is the next day or when I later in the afternoon. That gives us a sense of ability to look at it. So it is true, you're going to have a lot of ideas that aren't good, in fact. And that's just part of life. But for the book, for instance, about 10 years ago, I had this idea. I mean, that's a long time. And I was teaching classes about and workshops to musicians that were trying to be better, and they would always ask me, "Can you help me with my creative process?" And I said, "Oh," and I said, "What is my creative process?" And I didn't really capture that. And so for years, this conversation kept coming up and coming up. And so the reason all these other ideas for books and things I had, this one ended up being now, was because it was tested. It was, vetted with people who were interested. And then also I had the curiosity to keep uncovering things, to keep peeling away at it. It kept drawing me, just like that one song I mentioned, in a dream that was terrible. Well, this is one of those things I put down that I kept going back to and saying, oh, I kind of like that idea. And so when I'm songwriting with, collaborators, whatever, and I have an idea, it could be a great idea, but just where do you find it? Where do you fit it is kind of the process over time. So finally it came of time and, people who said, yeah, this is a good, you finally you can articulate this now in a way that before I didn't understand you when you were kept mentioning this thing about creative process, Rich, but now I get that. The robot and wizard come to you, the ideas of things like that to help you. So I think that's where, very quickly. So you start with preparation. I mentioned this is the 3 steps I have basically are based upon this research. So you have preparation, incubation, illumination, and elaboration. And that's very an academic and internationally, that's been something that the conversation around creativity is about. But all it is, like I mentioned, creativity, I'm learning preparation, I'm learning my scales. I'm kind of finding my way. Incubation is kind of that period where that's all there, but I have to kind of just be allowing it to go in the back of my head while I'm just doing my thing.
Wow.
I'm working. And then illumination is kind of Archimedes in the bathtub where boom, it hits. The idea comes to you. And what we do in creativity often is we think that moment is creativity. But we forget the invisible. The first 2 things that we've done that may take a long time, for me was years for the book, for instance, and thinking of macro 10 years ago. And this has been 2022 put the book out, but it takes a couple of years to write and research it and all that. Test the idea out. Okay. And so then you get to the point of elaboration. Well, now I'm writing, I'm taking my notes, I'm putting them all together, and I'm excited about it still. And I'm actually finish this thing and get it out. And I have friends who are publishers and things who are giving me great advice and objectively telling me that this is a good idea, which is important. So all those things, so it's underground, like the skyscraper, with the preparation and the incubation. And then that moment comes, it's like the beams just kind of like boom. One day we got a new apartment building here in the city I live, and all of a sudden it's there, but they've been working on it forever. And that's kind of how this happens. And so for me, I would love to just have this idea and I have the book and I could see it and we can all see things like that. But the journey feels like it's backwards at times. And if we give ourselves the freedom to, what is keeping us up, what's keeping us going, to see whatever it is we're working on that way, I think it keeps the better idea basically filters to the top. And so those 4 things I mentioned basically are how a lot of researchers will describe. And that's how this artist and the researcher who's the neuroscientist actually talk to each other about these things.
That's very, very powerful. So a few things there I just want to touch on. The first thing that you said that is so important, and I'm going to do a better job at this myself. And I invite everyone listening to think about how you can implement this in your own life. But the idea of writing down every idea, right? All these different ideas that you have, put them on paper, the flip chart, talk about them to people that you trust, right? Not people who are going to judge you and tell you why it can't happen, which might be more people than not, right? But put these ideas down because like you said, you had this idea for your book for 10 years before it went from, so it was in incubation phase for a long time, right? Yeah. So you prepared your skills, you had this idea, now this idea is incubating, and all of a sudden it's illuminated. You're putting it to work, you're writing, and then you are elaborating on it, which is the phase you're in right now as we have this conversation. So that's great. But if you didn't write that idea down, it might have been another 5 years until something happened with it. Right. And a lot of us have amazing ideas, but as we have it, whether it's because of self-doubt or, like you mentioned, poor mental health, or what we're going through in our life, or if we're not physically fit and we're down on ourselves or whatever it might be, we never put the idea down. And as a result, we begin to say things like, I am not creative. Creativity doesn't come easily to me. I am this, not that. You start to develop these belief statements. So putting these ideas down can be super important. And like you said, the second part of this that hit me is when other people are telling you it's also a good idea, you know that you're onto something. And again, other people could be even people on online forums saying, I wish that we had more of this. Or if you're reading book reviews and you go to the 1 stars and people are like, I wish this book included this, you could say, okay, that there's a need in the market for that specific thing. But even with music specifically, I was and still am to a large degree, but I'm getting better, very much that person who I love to pick up my acoustic guitar. I love to sing and I love to play guitar. So that's what I do. I just love to cover other people's music who I really enjoy, right? Bon Jovi, Pink Floyd, a lot of the classics, some newer stuff as well. But I got to the point where I'm like, rather than spend all this time learning other people's creative acts, I want to start creating my own. Right. So as I was playing, I put together some things. I started recording the riffs that I'm doing. I started recording some of the chord progressions, some of the lyrics I've have in a note now. So I've got this little database of chords and lyrics that I'm starting to put together. And just recently I was playing one of those chord progressions and my wife started humming it after I was done playing it. And I was like, that sounds familiar. And I was like, oh, that's what I was just playing. That's super cool. And I said, oh, what are you humming? And she's like, oh, it's that song that you were playing earlier. And immediately I was like, she didn't hum any of the other chord progressions, but she's humming this one. So maybe I'm on to something with this one. Maybe I should begin to develop this one. So based on everything you said, would you agree that maybe that's the one that I should begin to incubate further and illuminate further because it now has some market research behind it per se?
Yeah, I think when I think of those 3 steps, I think it's also you can go in any direction. You can figure, oh, this is a great idea. But then you have to also figure out, well, does it fit in a song? Can I make more of it? I'm talking with my hands, so I'm moving my microphone around. Sorry about that.
That's fine.
Anyway, so so I think it's a kind of, that's where you look at it as a process. It's not just this end thing where then I'm done. You are constantly learning, and other song ideas are probably going to come the more you try to figure out that. So you've basically you've been preparing, playing music for a long time, and all that's become a reservoir for you that you can now pull something from, because originality is really more of an iteration than it is a reinvention of everything. And so I think it's part of the freedom of what is creative too. It's like, we have 12 tones in the scale. So everybody, since J.S. Bach, which is a long time ago, by the way, if you wonder who he is, Bach is a musician who basically Western music's founded on. And he was an organist, and I think he had dozens of kids so he had to kind of like eat. So he had to live like any kind of person would today even. But so we do the same thing today. We take whatever the material is, and then we create more. And so, like as a musician, I would say, okay, now I have a reservoir of stuff I'm used to and comfortable with. How do I get more ideas? I have to then start beginning to mine further for other inspiration. So it might be listening to music that's something I don't even like, just to kind of learn from it and deconstruct it a little bit.
Huh.
It's kind of like we used to way back in the day in the 80s when I was a kid, like complain about Japan because they would, take apart American stuff and their stuff, but it became that their stuff actually became better than ours. The cars were holding up during that period of time, by the way, the cars you wanted to have. So I think that's kind of what happens is we look at what we're creating, and we can either stop there and say, I have this one idea and it works, or we can say, well, I'm finally having a process that if I keep at the process, I'm going to write more music that people are going to hum and they're going to like.
Yeah.
And so maybe 1 out of 15 at first, but the odds keep going up, the more I get those ideas, the more I keep at it. And that's just kind of how it works. So the process really is the goal, is finding whatever it was that got you to that humming part. You've been playing music X amount of time, and what is it that you diverge from? And maybe it's just finding one iteration away in some direction with what you
Oh,
already have that you haven't tried yet. And so oftentimes you mentioned earlier about we feel stuck or what's our next step to make. It is just a next step. And really it's about finding which one. And one of the fun stories I talk about in my book, just as a personal story, was my wife and I always dreamed when we were in our 20s, when we were together for a long time, we want to go to Paris. And, we didn't have a lot of money, part-time school teacher and a semi-unemployed musician writer. It's not like you have a lot of money. So, but we wanted to go to Paris. And so what did we do? So we came to one of our big anniversaries. I don't know if it was 15 or 20. We saved up a lot of money, but my wife got a new job. We had to cancel our trip. So we went to Vegas and we stayed at the Bellagio Hotel, and we basically had Paris in 2 days because she had to start a new job, and we spent all the money for the week. And it felt like it was, a bad thing, but we had to like step in a different direction. And we had this great memory of basically a 5-star 3 days, which we had never had before. But we said we still want to go to Paris. So we kept, saving money, and things happened again. And okay, well, we can't really make it this year, but I have found this great trip my wife discovered. Just go to Quebec. Quebec City is a beautiful little place. People don't know, and she knows French enough and investigated it. And I thought it was great because it's like, I love Canadians because it's like French people. It's like in Paris if you were to have beer everywhere. It's wonderful because there's pubs at every corner. It was wonderful. Plus all the patisseries and all that. We had a great time staying at an inn there. Um, and then, okay, well, that wasn't Paris yet, but a few years later, um, this was, just to date how old I am, our 30th anniversary, just a few years ago, we went to Paris. And we figured we had to be physically fit because we had to do it like 20s. It's all gonna be hoofing it everywhere. We
nice.
went to London, and we had this incredible memory, but it took us to these iterations over time for us to finally get to that one goal. And so, did we create an experience for us? Yes, we created several experiences and things in between those trips I mentioned. They're all headed in that same direction that kept our dream alive. So, a dream
Wow.
is not necessarily gonna happen in that moment. And if we look at life, we want to be an Olympic athlete or something, and we just don't have the body for it, like I don't, or the concentration, I wanna be as smart as a scientist, but my brain, I'm gonna I have different intelligence. So, we have to, though, iterate and find how that dream will take us on a journey,
Hmm.
and not be so worried sometimes about the exact immediate result of an idea. And so those ideas that you have may just need to be put in a drawer, like Disney would have entire um, theme parks that they would develop and put together and mock up, and they put them in a drawer.
Wow.
And 20 something years later, they will pull it out. So those people in our society who are the idea people, they know that. And so we talked about earlier about journaling or putting things down on paper, etc. Well, we had this goal written down about Paris and pictures and mood boards or whatever over time. And so it was wonderful to finally go and have an experience in Paris. And we're going to go back to Europe again and all those things. And we learn how to travel now, where you can live on nothing, and you can choose how many meals to eat a day and all those kind of fun things. But that took iterations. From what I thought Paris was a lot better, just to say this for truth,
Yeah.
um, and sweeter for all the things that we did to get to a destination. Because the journey, the things that were not seen before that by most people, is what got us there.
It's so true. It's so true. And that's a beautiful story, by the way. Thanks for sharing that. And it reminds me of when my wife and I, she was my fiance at this time, but we went to Italy. And actually, she wasn't my fiance yet. I was 20. She was 18 or 19. And we went to Italy, and we're 18, 20 years old. We're immature kids, essentially, right? But I've got a great sales job. And I was like, hey, let's go to Europe. Let's take a week and let's get a few weeks and go. And now I look back 10 years later and I'm like, man, I wish that I had waited to go to Italy until now. We could always go back, obviously, and we've gone other places too, not Paris, but we've been to Greece and stuff like that. But like, I just wish that I'd waited and maybe had done some other iterations first, because if I went now, knowing what I know now, knowing what I've done, I would be able to more fully appreciate that trip. And from going to Canada and from going to the other places that you've gone and then going to Paris, I can imagine it gave you a whole new depth of appreciation and even inspiration than if you had just gone to Paris in your 20s versus waiting until after your 30th anniversary. Would you agree with me, or am I off on a whole other
No,
can?
I think that's part of the journey. Of course, I would say if you can go somewhere, go. Because we don't know how many laps around the sun we have, and so part of that is it's the journey though too. Embrace the journey while you're doing it. It's great to have goals, achievements, and things like that, but also have ones big enough that you can't really do them tomorrow.
Yeah.
What's going to keep you going in life, I think, sometimes are those big things out there, and being kind of courageous enough to say, I'm not sure I can do that, and challenging yourself. Like we said, we're not sure we can afford that. We're on what we're doing at that point. But, I have a brother, he went to, they went scuba diving in the Red Sea and all this stuff when they were about the same age we were. And they don't have to regret that. I think it's all about though the next thing. Now what do I do with what I
Yeah.
have? Now what can I do with the reservoir of experiences? Um, because creativity really is about building life, building your life. It's
Yeah.
about how can I thrive, and so that process, is really about troubleshooting. Okay, what am I discovering? And some of us are really great at the development or delivery, but most of us, being the 80%, sometimes don't give enough time for discovery, for dream, the space that it would take for us to sit down and mood board something or bounce it off a person and be vulnerable about what it is. Like, here's an idea I might fail at, but somehow it's been bugging me for years. So discover ideas. Don't be afraid the fact that you're going to have to put them in a drawer, because Disney did that and they're doing pretty well for themselves.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's very reassuring too. One more time, in the description as well, you guys are going to find a link to Rich's book here. The title is Mind Blown: Unlock Your Creative Genius by Bridging Science and Magic, which we've talked a lot about so far. I'd like to ask you that idea of the next step. You're always focused on the next step. Is there a balance between that next step as building what you're currently doing versus doing something different? Like, when you think about your next step, and maybe think about it in terms of your book, we could think about it in terms of the show, the podcast. Is your next step generally building something that's already existing to make it better, or is it doing something new entirely? And is there a balance between those?
I think that's a great question, because it's what's in front of you, because creativity is about solving a problem or addressing a pain, and so really that can help determine what you need to work on next. So if I'm if there's a situation that needs solving, like all the people coming up to me about, Rich, what's your creative process? I'm addressing a pain that these folks are having, their lives, and the marketplace may be saying that to you or whatever. That's really a good point to say, well, this is where the iteration happens. But if no one's answering it and no one is saying whatever, then it may be the time to pull out and say, let's completely rethink whatever this is that we're dealing with, what's on the table. But the thing is, creativity isn't creating something from nothing. It's inventing from the discovery of what is in front of you, like going to a shipwreck and scuba diving down and finding treasure, and saying, "Oh, I could do something with this, or this is of something of value." So if we look at it that way, instead of just, I'm sitting in a room with a blank screen, I call it the blank canvas panic attack, which comes when you're a writer and the cursor is going like this on your screen. You're going, "What do I write?" That's why writing prompts are important. That's why things you do every day are important, because, yeah, you may not have anything earth shattering to do today, but hey, I have these 5 things I'm doing every day. I'm going to write an article. I'm going to, whatever it is, that are going to keep me going until that next big book or whatever it is on the table. So the pressure isn't to create the next incredibly big thing, it's just to keep creating.
Are you disciplined when it comes to the daily activities that you're putting forth in order to spark those new ideas and in order to build towards the next thing, like you just mentioned? So you mentioned writing the article and all those things. Are you disciplined when it comes to those daily things?
I wish I was more disciplined. So no, I think it's also like with rhythms, because like I can only run a certain, so many days a week, for instance. So I'm running like 3 days a week. One's like a 5K, and then two smaller runs because I have a little puppy, and it's kind of I have to manage him when I'm running. And so, am I exercising on a regular basis daily? Probably not. So creativity may be the same. I don't know what your rhythm is. See, I don't
Mm,
know what the rhythm is of what you create. But music, I'm doing something a little bit with music every day because if I don't,
mhm.
I lose it.
Yep.
So, but I may not be, if I have nothing to do with music and I could sit down for, an hour or 30 minutes or less even, and, reintroduce myself to some things. And so, yeah, so I think it does require a daily rhythm of some kind to keep yourself sharp. And I think that is a struggle for some of us more than others. For some of us, the struggle is to add to that or to switch up something because you're great at your list. But just like with the trainer I used to have, it's like, okay, now you got this, Rich. We're going to add weight to that, and we're going to start doing these kinds of stretches. And I said, oh, those ones hurt now. Well, of course they do because you've never done those ones before. So I think that's kind of part of how it is. It's a human process. So it's not going to look like a machine,
Yeah.
um, and it's not going to be like a clock, but it still has to happen on a regular basis.
And like you mentioned earlier, it's very much what's in front of you, right? So when I asked you, are you disciplined with the daily activities? You went to running. Right now, if you had a marathon coming up, then your daily disciplines might be different because it's in
Yes.
front of you. But like you said, you're working on music every day because that is something that's in front of you, something that you're working on all the time. And you've always got an event coming up. So I think, like you said, we've got the journey and then we've got the events on the
Oh,
journey.
oh yeah. That's a great way of looking at it because that's kind of how life is. We have big markers and big things that we work towards. And then like for me, running at this point is I want to, not I want to be able to go back to Paris or actually to Italy and run up those cobblestone streets that go really steep and not die. You
Yeah.
know, I want to be able to do that. So and not just fall asleep on a gondola like there's one meme I just saw where these two old people are going like this. And it's
Yeah.
like it says travel when you're young.
Yeah.
Um,
I've seen that too.
so I'm thinking like, okay, that's why I run. So there's impetus for it, right?
Okay.
Otherwise, because who wants to? Unless and creativity sometimes feels like that. It's just being human.
Well said. Everyone, Rich's book, again, is Mind Blown. Unlock Your Creative Genius by Bridging Science and Magic. The link is in the description to go grab your copy from Amazon. Rich, where's the best place for people to follow you? Are you specifically somewhere on social media where we can follow your journey?
I'm I'm on social media, IG, and all those places. RK Weblog is usually a handle I use, but you can find me at RK for Rich Kirkpatrick, rkblog.com. And it'll send you to whatever. Also, I have an audio blog there, which is kind of old school way of uh,
It's cool.
writing them, but still, trying to hold on to the non-video part of it.
One final question for you, if I could.
Hmm.
If you had to impart us with one idea or philosophy that would help us think differently about creativity or that would help us to generate more ideas, what would be that one thing that you'd share with us to wrap this up?
The one thing I would say is this: I create, therefore I am. And instead of just I think or I ask questions or whatever, I create. So in order to really feel valuable for yourself, that could be all you need to say. And that is creating your own life. That's uh, whether it's dinner parties for some of us or whatever, whether it's you're a home brewer or someone, I'm homebrew coffee. I wish I could homebrew beer, but I can't. But whatever that is, because you create, you are. And I think it's important to see yourself that way, not because someone says it's great or not, but because you can keep creating.
That's beautiful, man. I create, therefore I am. I did not expect that. And just the way you came up with that immediately it's powerful in itself. So thanks for sharing that. Rich, this has been a great conversation. Thank you for helping me unlock my creativity. And I believe the same for everyone listening too. If you made it to this point, you feel the same way. So thank you, Rich, for joining us on the show today.
My pleasure.
Let me know what you guys think from that conversation with Rich. That was very eye-opening in many ways. It was inspirational because he gave us the hope and the knowingness that we are all creative. It's all about how we express that creativity, right? Are we more the magician or are we more the robot? Neither is good or bad, right? It's based on our environment, how we grew up, based on the way we were born. But how are we expressing our creativity on a daily basis? Are we writing down and documenting our ideas? Are we being conscious of the journey that we're on the way to those large events, right? So I took a lot away from this conversation when it comes to expressing my creativity and sparking that creativity. And I want to know from you, what was your biggest takeaway? Let me know in the comments, send me an email as well, whatever way works best for you. The number one way that you can support this conversation is, and to dive in deeper into the concepts that we talked about, because we're very surface level, go deeper with Rich's book, Mind Blown, Unlock Your Creative Genius by Bridging Science and Magic. Grab your copy in the Amazon link below. Below, you'll also find Rich's website, which again is rkblog.com. And think about that as the main place that will help you to find him on all the different social platforms, wherever you like to spend your time. Thank you so much for watching and listening. I hope you got a ton out of this conversation. And until we talk again next time, continue to be better.